Hello, this is Brad Carmack. I'm the author of Homosexuality, A Straight BYU Student's Perspective. You may obtain this book for free by going to bradcarmack.blogspot.com and downloading it. You may also obtain a hard copy by emailing me a request at homosexualityperspective@yahoo.com. We're going to continue building a moral case for LDS same-sex marriage, beginning with reason number 12, that same-sex advocates may turn out to be pro-family, based on the presumption that we are a pro-family church. Okay, so let's look at the question by comparison of, was George Washington a traitorous rebel or a freedom fighter? Okay, now the answer to that question doesn't really turn so much on the nature of George Washington's activities, but usually it's going to turn on whether the judge is a Tory or a patriot, an American, or someone that was British at the time and was loyal to the crown. Now, in a similar way, a lot of people that oppose same-sex marriage see same-sex marriage advocates as a threat to the family, and in fact see same-sex marriage itself as a threat to the family. Other people see advocates of same-sex marriage as family freedom fighters. Now, either view can cause problems, and here's why. Over the last year, I've worked with a couple of prominent LDS scholars who have been very outspoken in opposing same-sex marriage, and I've heard both of them pejoratively refer to agenda-driven gay activists. And it's obvious that they have a low opinion of these gay activists. I've seen similar vitriol from some of these same-sex marriage advocates who are gay activists as they talk about people that defend traditional family. Neither attitude is very impressive. At the end of the day, you've only got people on both sides. And these people are just like you. They wake up in the morning, they eat breakfast, they face challenges, they go to bed again at night. And I think that as members of the church and as Christians, we want to be very careful and to avoid harboring hateful feelings towards any person or group. It's never appropriate to demonize the opposition when the opposition is only constituted of moral people. And it's also, for the same reason, we should probably avoid vilifying or demonizing same-sex marriage, because we can't really be sure whether or when the case for same-sex marriage will ultimately prevail. Here's a quote. With marriage in America declining in appeal and statistical success, it can use help from whatever quarter. Homosexuals constitute a minority that wishes to affirm this institution and its ideals. Contrary to the hue and cry raised by the extreme right, gays are not trying to dismantle marriage, but rather to extend its stabilizing influence on society. By entering into it, they are attempting as individuals and as couples to be socially responsible. And I would point out that marriage connects a couple with their community. And for decades, the heterosexual majority has snubbed and excluded homosexuals and same-sex couples. The efforts of some homosexual-oriented people to seek marriage can thus be viewed as an act of forgiveness. After so many years of offensive persecution and discrimination, they are still willing to attempt reconciliation, to attempt for this connection between the couple and the community. Of course, many homosexual-oriented people are not as forgiving and don't seek for same-sex marriage. And they want to have a separate status. The status that society is relegated to. Here's another quote. At a time when marriage needs all the support and participation it can get, homosexuals are pleading to move beyond cohabitation. They want the licenses, the vows, the rings, the honeymoons, the anniversaries, the in-laws, the benefits, and yes, the responsibilities and routines. Same-sex marriage offers the opportunity for a dramatic public affirmation that marriage is for everybody and that nothing else is as good. And who is telling gays to just shack up instead? The self-styled friends of matrimony. End quote. Now, it's not clear to everyone whether same-sex marriage strengthens or weakens the family, but in the meantime, civil and respectful opposition to same-sex marriage advocacy is appropriate for those whose consciences so dictate. Okay, so that's reason number 12, is that same-sex advocates may turn out to be pro-family. Let's move on to reason number 13, which I've titled The Deadness of the Law. Let me start out with a quote here. Religion should not be a scaffold to maintain the privilege of being right, so much as it should be a ladder that prompts us in doing and becoming good. It's one of my favorite quotes. Now, many faithful members of the LDS Church, they feel a duty bound to follow the brethren. It comes from the LDS divine command theory that whatever God commands is the highest duty, and that the brethren are reporting what God commands. They feel, some church members, that they have to follow the brethren in insisting that homosexual orientation is chosen, in insisting that homosexual orientation is abominable, in claiming that homosexually oriented members should try very hard to change because homosexual orientation is contrary to God's plan and because it can be routinely reversed. Now, either or both of these ideas unquestionably imposes excruciating hardship that's unnecessary on homosexual-oriented Latter-day Saints, as is abundantly evidenced by their accounts and also by their disturbingly elevated suicide rates. And though I and many others we conclude that members are not bound in this way, I don't condemn those who judge otherwise and feel that they are bound to insist that homosexual orientation is chosen, to insist that homosexual-oriented members should try hard to change, and that they should, some of them should be celibate for their whole lives. But I also don't condemn the 50% of participants in the Milgram experiments who hurt innocent people because an authority figure instructed them to. In this experiment, there were ordinary people who repeatedly, according to their own understanding, sent lethal shocks of electricity into the bodies of people who were screaming at the top of their lungs and urgently protesting for their lives, merely because an authorized experimenter told them to. I might even exculpate the 200 or so faithful members who, under the explicit direction of their Mormon church leaders, massacred in cold blood over 100 unarmed men in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It was these very leaders who told them to massacre, who, under the pretense of a white flag and the promise of safe passage, beguiled this band of traveling emigrants to yield up their weapons before commanding their slaughter. The situation of today's duty-bound members is not very different from that of pre-Christ Jews, who were required to impose excruciating hardship on homosexually behaving people by stoning them to death. The difference today is that the imposed excruciating hardship is persistent rather than temporary, meaning it goes over the lifespan instead of ending mercifully in death. So to members who feel similarly duty-bound to harm homosexual-oriented people, I would recommend to them by analogy the account of a homosexual stoning pre-Christ society of Jews in 2 Nephi 25. I'll read a few passages. And notwithstanding we believe in Christ, we keep the law of Moses, and look forward with steadfastness unto Christ until the law shall be fulfilled. For this end was the law given, wherefore the law hath become dead unto us, and we are made alive in Christ because of our faith. Yet we keep the law because of the commandments. Wherefore we speak concerning the law, that our children may know, when the deadness of the law, that they need not harden their hearts against him, when the law ought to be done away. Again, I've entitled this reason, the deadness of the law. I think that though we keep the law of Moses, we should look forward to when that law shall be fulfilled, and we need not, hopefully in the future, stone our homosexual-oriented brothers and sisters in the ways that some of us feel duty-bound to do. Though some report being able to switch their orientation, the predominance of attempts to reverse orientation result in heart-wrenching anguish, intense suffering, abject failure, and excruciating disappointment. And so I would say that embracing same-sex marriage is one way to send the vital message that the unchosen characteristic of homosexual orientation is not evil, and instead can, like heterosexual orientation, be channeled to further God's purposes for his children during mortality. I think that's a vital message, and I think it's one that would be sent by an embrace of same-sex marriage. Okay, so that's reason number 13. Reason number 14 is that the afterlife doesn't necessarily argue against same-sex marriage. This is sort of how the argument against same-sex marriage goes on this basis. There are no homosexual unions or marriages in heaven, as the primary goal of life on earth is to create eternal family units. If you give validity to a same-sex union that will have no validity after this life, then it's going to be counterproductive for those so engaged. Plus, if same-sex attraction is a mortal test equivalent to blindness or Down syndrome or mental illness, the individuals who suffer from same-sex attraction here won't suffer from it after they die or the resurrection. So we do harm to them by encouraging or blessing what will ultimately be self-destructive behavior to them. So that's sort of the contention. In response, I would ask two questions. First, how well is celibacy, lifelong celibacy, how's their track record for creating eternal family units? That would be my first question and response. And second, I would ask by way of comparison, what do you do when a woman has a husband that dies in a car crash 2 weeks after they're sealed in the temple? Okay, if a woman can only be sealed to one man, and it would be unfair to her first spouse, who committed no fault, to lose his wife to another man, what LDS man would want to marry such a woman to whom he could not be sealed? And if they did get married and had children, would the children be the posterity of the first husband or the second? Would the second husband spend his whole life raising and building relationships with his spouse and another man's children only to lose his wife and or his children in the afterlife? What rational man in the church would entertain even for a minute the idea of dating this woman when he could marry somebody else that he could be with for eternity? Some people would say if she was unlucky enough to have her sealed spouse die early on, maybe she should have done a better job in protecting him, and so it justifies being invalid in the church for the rest of her life as a legitimate marriage partner. Perhaps single women that are born infertile, and in the woman-heavy dating market, they'd reasonably be passed up in favor of a woman who can meet the church's naturally reproducing ideal. Maybe they're also rightly disadvantaged as God's sort of comeuppance for some transgression on their part. Now I hope that these examples strike you as repugnant as they do me. But the important point is here that for homosexual-oriented people, just like the woman whose husband died, they chose their circumstance equally, meaning they didn't choose it at all. And it doesn't make sense to punish people for choices that aren't choices for them, for conditions that they did not select. Okay, and so I'd say that our Christian hearts go out to people in these situations, like to the woman whose husband died 2 weeks after they were sealed in the temple. And for some of us, our Christian hands go out as well, trying to form some sort of accommodation that will help to enable them to have a family experience in this life, even if it's less than the celestial law, sort of a remedy or accommodation. As a side note, I would note that we obviously don't live a celestial law yet. We live the law of tithing, not consecration. Under the celestial law, looking on a woman to lust after her is adultery. For that offense, we wouldn't even remove a man from his calling, let alone disfellowship or excommunicate him. In heaven, there's no divorce. We have frequent and regular temple divorces here on earth. That's kind of a side note. But I would ask, what are some of the products of these Christian hands that want to help out these people in what we would consider unfortunate circumstances? Well, I'll give some examples. A bishop, he might counsel a man to give the young widow serious consideration as a marriage partner, even though she may be infertile or sealed to another man. An understanding young woman might consider dating and marrying an infertile man, even knowing that they will never have their own biological children. A young husband who learns shortly after the wedding that his wife can't have children might decide that despite his belief in the importance of rearing his own biological children, that he's going to stay with her anyway. An infertile couple might be encouraged to draw on reproductive technologies, even though the church in the past has disfavored unnatural types of reproduction. Many couples would seek adoption. Maybe two old people whose spouses have both passed away that they were sealed to, they might marry each other in the temple for time only, or be married by a bishop for time only. The common thread through all these examples is that their attempts in the here and now in mortality to provide as much of a family experience as possible to people in a difficult situation that they did nothing to choose. My question is, why aren't we more interested in helping homosexual-oriented people whose family prospects are limited for the same non-chosen reasons to have as much of a family experience as they can? The quote here is, "If God wants to change the orientation of their sexual feelings in their afterlife, that matter is in His hands, but we can make their lives better here and now." And I would say the same thing. Going back to the young widow example, rather than prescribing lifelong celibacy for this woman, most of us would encourage her to marry and to rear children. We would hope that men wouldn't write her off as a marriage candidate. And if we would ask and encourage this couple to marry, knowing that they'd be separated in the afterlife, why would we do it? I think the reason is because there's value to the companionship, there's value to the marriage. Even if it's only during mortality, it's better than being single. Being with a spouse is better than being alone your whole life. Moses 3:18 says it's not good that the man should be alone. And I think that that's a strong reason why considerations of the afterlife don't necessarily argue against same-sex marriage. There's a quote here that, and this is sort of the position I think that's being argued here in this moral case for LDS same-sex marriage. It's not necessarily for marriages in the temple, but it says that the church need not accept gay marriages as eternal. Again, this is a quote. It would not need to offer temple gay marriages. They could be regarded like civil marriages for this life only. As the church views the matter, adjustments are going to have to be made in an afterlife anyway for many people, because many situations involving marriage, singleness, or parent-child nurture relationships are not ideally finalized. For those who do their best to live uprightly, given their varying mortal circumstances, the afterlife will doubtlessly satisfactorily resolve itself. And we know there's a lot of uncertainty about the afterlife. For instance, the Church Handbook of Instruction 17.2.10 says that temple ordinances are not performed for stillborn children. However, this does not deny the possibility that a stillborn child will be a part of the family in the eternities. The afterlife is a lot less black and white than we sometimes think, and in the end we just don't know. And the bottom line is, if we expect that God will work it out somehow in the afterlife, in the remarried widow example, must we not also expect that God could and would work it out somehow in the afterlife for homosexual same-sex couples? Okay, that concludes reason number 14, which is that the afterlife doesn't necessarily argue against same-sex marriage. Okay, number 15. This is another reason that supports moral same-sex LDS same-sex marriage, and I've entitled this section that a revealed religion need not be conservative. I'm going to start out with a quote that defines the church that I really like. It says, "The church is imperfect. However, it is the best instrument that the Lord has given our agency to effect his purposes. If it is at times inefficient, backwards, repressive, it is also at times instructive, progressive, and liberating. The church is like us." I'll go further. The church is us. It is no better or no worse than we are, and that includes you and me, for the church is what we make it. I had an interesting conversation with my brother at one point over the internet, and I'm going to quote a little bit from some of our discussion there. This is what I said. "It seems strange that religion should be years behind societal changes. You'd think that instead that at least a revelation-based religion would be light years ahead on important issues of social justice and truth because of their access to a source of omniscience. And though I can see the wisdom of a non-revelation-based religions using a conservative approach, similar to like a judicial branch, it seems the revealed religion would be fresh and bold, fearless and progressive, a lot like Joseph Smith, rather than slow to change and risk-averse. But there could be a more sensible explanation. But I think that we do observe some conservative practices in the church that need not necessarily be so. And that's sort of the point of this section here in favor of same-sex marriage, is that a revealed religion need not be conservative. In fact, it could be breathtakingly progressive because of its access to truth and to heaven. A couple more quotes from that dialogue. "Given the doctrinal support for the idea that God doesn't work among men except according to their faith, and that he doesn't reveal until his children ask," for instance, you look at the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a collection of interrogatories and the answers to those questions, it would seem to make sense for church members and leaders to be knocking at the doors of heaven to obtain answers to tough questions such as homosexual privileges, surrogate motherhood, and social justice, rather than shutting their praying mouths on a "we've got all we need" basis, kind of like the Jews did to Jesus after the Old Testament, or that many do to President Monson today, saying that the New Testament was the last word. Proverbs 2 verse 3 says, "If thou criest after knowledge, and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seekest her as silver, and searchest for her as for hidden treasures, thou shalt understand the fear of the Lord, and find the knowledge of God." By comparison, I would say that President Kimball's worrying, praying, and raising the issue likely resulted in lifting the priesthood ban against blacks. God rarely, if ever, uses his prophets as teletype machines who mindlessly transmit God's will for word. Instead, he requires prophets, as he does individuals, to inquire with some thought as to potential answers. Kimball's predecessor, Harold B. Lee, who was speaking on the subject the day he became president, said that he intended to stand by and wait until the Lord speaks. But this passive strategy did not lift the ban. We have to be proactive. This is a quote, "God does notice us and he watches over us, but it is usually through another person that he meets our needs." In my dialogue with my brother, I said, perhaps if prophets a century earlier had cared to pray about and resolve the issue, the ban would have been lifted then. And indeed, 9 years earlier, the ban was lifted in the late 1960s. And in November 1969, the Quorum of the 12 passed a proposal that would allow full priesthood for blacks. Since President McKay was incapacitated, the two counselors in the First Presidency could have signed the rarely but sometimes used joint declaration of the First Presidency and the Quorum to grant priesthood to those of black African ancestry. Apostle Lee, absent during the decision, returned and persuaded the Quorum to rescind their vote, holding to the traditional belief as revealed in the Old Testament that the races ought to be kept together. Apostle LeGrand Richards wrote in 1967, "I always say I am not half as much concerned about pleasing the Lord as I am about pleasing all of the brethren." Lee then pressured First Counselor Hugh B. Brown into signing a statement reaffirming the ban. Of this experience, Hugh B. Brown's grandson wrote, and this is a quote, "Grandfather managed to add language to Elder Lee's statement, endorsing full civil rights for all citizens, but he still resisted signing the statement. However, he suffered from advanced age in the late stages of Parkinson's disease and was ill with the Asian flu. With Grandpa in this condition, Elder Lee brought tremendous pressure to bear upon him, arguing that with President McKay incapacitated, Grandfather was obligated to join the consensus of the Quorum of the 12. Now, of course, there are striking parallels between the priesthood ban and homosexuality. Brown wrote during that same year, "Personally, I doubt if we can maintain or sustain ourselves in the position which we seem to have adopted, but which has no justification as far as the scriptures are concerned so far as I know. I think we're going to have to change our decision on that. The President says it can only come by revelation. If that be true, then it will come in due course. I think it is one of the most serious problems confronting us because, of course, it affects the millions of colored people." Now, to talk more about this principle of revealed religion not needing to be conservative, Joseph Smith, he says, "There has been a great difficulty in getting anything into the heads of this generation. It has been like splitting hemlock knots with a corn dodger, which is a piece of cornbread, for a wedge, and a pumpkin for a beetle, which is a wooden mallet. Even the saints are slow to understand." He also said the following, "I have tried for a number of years to get the minds of the saints prepared to receive the things of God, but we frequently see some of them, after suffering all they have for the works of God, will fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions. They cannot stand the fire at all. How many will be able to abide a celestial law and go through and receive their exaltation, I am unable to say, as many are called but few are chosen. Why be so certain that you comprehend the things of God, when all things with you are so uncertain? Some people say I am a fallen prophet because I do not bring forth more of the word of the Lord. Why do I not do it? Are we able to receive it? No, not one in this room." Now, I've heard, in comparison again to blacks in the priesthood, I've heard people say that same-sex marriage will never be approved, and it kind of makes me cringe. Some claim that homosexual behavior will never be approved because that would be counter to the plan of salvation, and this is based on the conclusion that homosexual behavior is inherently wrong, malum in se, rather than merely malum prohibitum, or wrong because it's prohibited. And this is frustrated by the simple difficulty of reconciling the plan with the reality of homosexual orientation. Severe mental retardation, early death, living your whole life as a single sister. None of these fit in with the plan, but they all seem involuntary. And so what is to be done for these misfits? I think, again, by way of comparison, we take a look at Bruce R. McConkey's after statement when the priesthood ban was lifted. He said the following, "There are statements in our literature by the early brethren that we have interpreted to mean that the Negroes would not receive the priesthood in mortality. I have said the same things, and people write me letters and say, 'You said such and such, and how is it now that we do such and such?' All I can say is it is time disbelieving people repented and got in line and believed in a living modern prophet. Forget everything that I have said, or what President Brigham Young, or George Q. Cannon, or whoever has said in days past that is contrary to the present revelation. We spoke with a limited understanding, and without the light and knowledge that has now come into the world. It doesn't make a particle of difference what anybody ever said about the Negro matter before the first day of June 1978. It is a new day and a new arrangement, and the Lord has now given the revelation that sheds light out into the world on this subject. As to any slivers of light or any particles of darkness of the past, we forget about them. We now do what Meridian Israel did when the Lord said the gospel should go to the Gentiles. We forget all about the statements that limited the gospel to the house of Israel, and we start going to the Gentiles." End of quote. Again, the conclusion here is that it's only the most recent revelation that counts. The bottom line, the members of the church are, or at least they should be, prepared to follow wherever God leads them. If social progress justifiably is moving towards an embrace of same-sex marriage socially, religiously, and legally, then my question is, why shouldn't Christ's revealed church be ahead of the curve? And that concludes reason number 15 about a moral case for same-sex marriage. We'll begin the next clip with reason 16, because we supported polygamy.